All right, I think that's everybody in. So, welcome everyone to the fifth talk in our series of Mourne memories of places from the past. Tonight we have got Eoin Halpin with us again, who did a couple of talks last week, if you weren't at them. And tonight he's going to be talking about In the Footsteps of St. Patrick. And just before I hand over to Eoin, a couple of bits of housekeeping if you haven't been on the calls before. Everybody's muted at the minute. If we can try to leave it that way. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them on the chat window. But at the end of the talk, we can open up the floor to anybody that wants to ask questions, and you can unmute yourself at that point. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Eoin. That's it. We can see your screen now, Eoin.
Okay.
Super.
All right. And everybody, you can hear me there, Aidan, can you? So if you can, everybody can.
I can hear you, yeah.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Monday night talk. When I was putting this talk together, I had a look at that screen and I thought it reminded me of when they interview Ole Gully Solskjaer after a football match. All these logos appear on the screen behind him. But in fact, they're all quite important. Obviously, the Heritage Lottery Fund and Tullymore United Football Club are the people who are putting together these talks. But along the bottom, I'm going to be talking about excavations that were carried out by Archaeological Development Services and the Centre for Archaeological Fieldwork in Queens. And a lot of the work that I did in advance of the construction of the St. Patrick's Visitor Centre was funded by Down County Council, as it was then, or Down District Council, and now the Newry, Mourne and Down District Council. So my thanks to them and everybody else that needs to be thanked, as the man says. So really, I suppose what I want to talk this evening about is a group of excavations that took place, and investigations indeed, that took place in and around Cathedral Hill in Downpatrick. An aerial photograph there showing the site on the lower slopes of the hill, with the cathedral and then the mound of Down behind, and in the distance the Grey Abbey, or not Grey Abbey, but Inch Abbey. And just as while I have this photograph up, it's important to note the amount of dry ground around the foot of the hill, which is only quite a recent archaeological or physical landscape feature, but more about that later. So the site, for those of you who aren't familiar with Downpatrick, the site is on the lower slopes of Cathedral Hill, on the southeast of the hilltop itself, at the back of the car park area, which serves the group of shops that front out onto the Dundrum or the Clock Road. I was asked to undertake an archaeological assessment and then full-scale archaeological excavation in advance of the construction of the St. Patrick's Visitor Centre, which is outlined in red there on the graphic. You can see Downpatrick Cathedral Hill with the cathedral on top of it. Again, this is probably pushing people's memories back a bit, but they were going back to 1998 when there was no Downpatrick Visitor Centre. And we had the Rose Garden, if you remember, which in my memory of the Rose Garden was a place where gentlemen of the town would go up with their bottles of cheap wine and happily sit and drink the afternoon away. Quite happily, I'd have to say. But when we first moved in, we got quite a ragging from from the gentleman who decided that we were destroying their cultural amenity. So, but nonetheless, they vacated the area and we proceeded with our archaeological excavations. So that's the site sort of post building, but you can see the sort of the slope that we were dealing with, the higher ground. So up to the left is the level of the cathedral itself, and then it slopes down via a series of terraces down to the car park at the bottom. And this was the ground prior to the construction of the visitor centre that we had to excavate. So the excavation itself started in 2000 and or 1998, goes back a long way. But the whole area was topsoil stripped of the grass and a lot of the rose gardens that were there. People may remember that there were quite a steep terrace of steps going up from the car park at the bottom to the car park down here at the bottom, up a series of steps up to the top, and that was all cleared back, and then archaeological excavation commenced. So this is what it looked like once we had cleared most of the topsoil. The steps, you can see the people sitting on each of the people standing on each of the terraces. They were when we actually uncovered this area, the actual terraces themselves had been covered with a layer of topsoil. So we actually re-excavated a lot of the terraces, stepping down from the top right down to the bottom. And the only archaeology we found in this sort of area was associated with the 19th and 20th century material, and nothing of major archaeological import. The site of these terraces turned out to have their origins in the almshouse and school, which dates to the 1730s, and this was effectively the back gardens of the almshouse and school. And you can see there at the bottom that it was built in 1733 to house 6 men and 6 women and school for 10 poor children. So it effectively, we uncovered the gardens, if you like, associated with the almshouse. Was the first, I suppose, the first bit of archaeology that we came across in the excavations. On removal of the terracing, the first large-scale feature that we came across was a large ditch, U-shaped ditch, which ran north to south through the centre of the site. It was substantial, the order of 2 or 3 meters across and as much as a meter deep. Obviously got deeper in places, but that was due to the differential scarping of the terracing that associated with the almshouse. So again, the excavation of this feature produced material of 17th, 18th century date, nothing substantially earlier. But you'll notice that the ditch itself cuts this north-south ditch here. If I could get my pointer back, there we go. So this ditch here cut this ditch running along east-west along the bottom of the hill. So quite clearly it was quite a late feature. In fact, as you can see there, the line cuts almost everything in its path. And archaeologically, that indicates that it's probably the latest feature, one of the latest features on the site. So this is what the feature looked like partly through excavation. We had a total excavation of it halfway up, and that's, you can see the shape of it. It's U-shaped in profile, quite wide, and runs right up the middle of the site through the almshouse at the on top of the hill. Again, this isn't the bottom of it down here. This is partially excavated. It was excavated about halfway up. So basically what we did was we cut a series of trenches across the ditch rather than excavate the entire thing, just to get a profile along its length. And as I say, this turned out to be an early field boundary. You can see it traced right the way across the top of the hill, from all the way up past the infantry barracks on the far side of the hill, through the up past English Street, down through the almshouse, and down again onto the bottom of the slope. So this feature is effectively quite a late field boundary, recorded, as you say, on the Ordnance Survey 2nd edition, so presumably dating to somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, possibly the late 18th century. However, as soon as we started to clear back much of the overburden, a number of major sort of archaeological concentrations of features started to appear. On the west of on the extreme east of the site, we came across what appeared to be a series of hut sites, defined by circular gullies and scarps. So the crescent banana-shaped features that you can see there on the graphic, they are actually scarped slopes. So they dug into the side of the hill and they pulled material forward to create so they dug into the side of the hill here and they pulled material forward to create a platform on which to build their huts. But later scarping had removed a lot of the evidence, but we did have, as you can see here, this curving line running around here, showing the curving line of a hut site with the hearth still surviving in the middle and a series of post holes in its core. We got some souterrain wear from features within the hut circle, the hut site complex, and that would suggest a date of an early medieval date, somewhere around between 500 and 1000 AD for this complex of sites. Again, it's important to note that the large ditch feature, again, my pointer seems that the large ditch feature that runs across the bottom of the site, it cut the bottom of that hut circle, which means that that ditch is later than the hut sites. So those hut sites are not associated with this ditch down here. Again, these huts would have been somewhere in the region of 10 to about 10 meters in diameter, probably defined by a series of post holes and gullies. The gullies probably are to divert water coming down the hill and then diverting water around the side of the hut in order to keep the actual platform on which the hut was built relatively dry. So the ditches that we found along the bottom of the site were interesting insofar as they weren't continuous. In other words, we had a ditch running from the west side of the site for about 10 or 15 meters into the site, and we had a ditch terminal. And then we have another ditch. Again, the terminal of that ditch was cut by the later field boundary, which ran north-south, which talked about earlier. That terminal that must have been cut by the later ditch field boundary, and this ditch continued on in an easterly direction and continued on beyond the edge of the site. The pottery that we found from within this ditch would suggest a sort of a 12th to 13th century date, which again would conform with the idea that this ditch, again, excuse me, there we are. This ditch here cut our much earlier hut circle sites, and so this feature here and this feature here presumably are 11th, 12th, 13th century date, creating a boundary running along the foot of the hill. So this is what they look like in the field. Again, you can see about 2 meters wide and the guts of 1.5 meters in depth. And again, we excavated, this is the terminal of one of the ditches, and we excavated a series of slots running across the foot of the hill, and it ran out beyond the area of the excavation to the east. Again, substantially deep, a very substantial ditch running along the bottom of the hill. And this is the same feature looking west. Again, here's the blackened feature of the ditch here, running from here right across to here, and it runs then in this direction out towards the gentleman there standing excavating the ditch at the western end of the site. So we have a ditch running up to a point, and then it dog legs almost, and then the next ditch carries on the line of the fortification along the foot of the hill. So you can see that what I'm talking about there. There's the ditch running in from the west. It stops, and then the ditch continues with a gap between the two ditches running further to the east. But the material that we got from this ditch and the material we got from this ditch were similar, suggesting they're both the same date. So as well as the ditches and the hut sites, we found two kiln sites, suggesting again the material that we got from the two kilns would suggest that they were corn drying kilns. We got a series of seed deposits from the bottom of kiln number 1. We didn't get anything from kiln number 2, but the form would suggest that they were they were similar. So kiln 1, very well made, was lined in stone down to its base, and it was dug into the side of the hill. So it was the mouth of the kiln was at the surface on the downslope side, and then the floor of the kiln ran straight into the hillside, creating a big bowl, the guts of 1 meter to 1.5 meters in depth. And it was from the base of this feature down here that we got a deposit of seeds and corn, suggesting that it was to do with corn drying rather than any other function. To the south of that, we got a sort of part of an enigmatic structure, the corner of in green here. Again, my cursor has disappeared on me. Apologies for that. No, that's not what I want. No, it doesn't. So the area in green. There we go. So the area in green here at the bottom, we got the right-angled corner of a structure, again with a series of posts and pits inside it, suggesting that this might have been a rectangular structure. We're of unknown date. We didn't find anything really within the feature to suggest a date. But associated with the kiln, we got a series of other pits, again presumably associated with the function of this area as corn drying. The other kiln was found again to the south east of the first kiln, similar in shape but not as well preserved. It was not stone lined; it was earth cut in its entirety, but again deposits from the base or from within the fill gave an indication that this also might have been corn drying in its form. You can see the association of the corn drying with the ditch itself. This is the ditch feature, substantial feature running along the bottom with the kiln close by. And this is what the kiln looked like. You can see the classic sort of keyhole shape. It's got a bulbous end on the upslope side, with the sort of bulbous end at this end up here, and then the flue running downslope to the south. So very substantial feature. Again, material would suggest that it was corn drying in its function. So perhaps in retrospect, at the time I didn't realize it, but in retrospect, probably one of the most interesting areas was the area that we found outside. Well, I say outside the ditch. The ditch itself was quite clearly later than this group of features which we found on the flat ground at the very bottom of the hill. At the time, we thought that it might been well, we knew it was metalworking at the time. because of the amount of slag and burnt material we found from it. But let's go back there. But we know it must be earlier than the 12th, 13th century, because this ditch here, which we know to be 12th and 13th century, clearly cut the features associated with the metalworking area. So this metalworking area must have been, even in the field, at least pre 13th century. We also thought that it was an interesting position in terms of its association with the gap in the ditch. So the gap in the ditch that we noted during the excavations, this area here, which we had ditch 1 and ditch 2 leaving an entrance, we thought that at the time that this metalworking area might have been positioned close to that entrance, but removed from the actual hill, the function of the hill itself, metalworking area being a particularly smelly, smoky, noisy function. We thought it might have been removed down the bottom of the hill to keep it out of the way. However, that theory quickly went out the window. So this is the nature of of what we found: a massive amounts of pits and gullies, post holes, a substantially deep charcoal flecked pit right in the middle, surrounded by this sub-rectangular enclosure, which we presume would have gone further down here, but was truncated at this point. It didn't appear to go beyond this point on the east, but it probably created a U-shaped sort of windbreak structure around the metalworking. So apart from the internal substantial pit, which was almost full of red oxidized soil and charcoal, the other important features were a set of 4 paired post holes, very substantial features. You can see them marked in red on the graphic. We have on either side of the pit, and these post holes were of the order of 300 millimeters deep, so each were about a foot and a half deep, and about a foot wide. So we're talking something in the region of a fairly small telegraph pole, something of that order in each of those pits. And the presumption is that it was, the interpretation, should I say, was that these 4 post holes, these 4 sets of post holes, would have carried some sort of structure which would have sat over the fire pit and would have been some integral part of metalworking in this particular area. At the time of the excavation, Brian Scott, who's an archaeometallurgist, which is a queer name for somebody who's an archaeologist who's interested in metalworking, when he visited the site, he had a look at the slag, and he thought, from looking at the slag, that it potentially was a Bronze Age, Iron Age date. In other words, he could see slag that was indicative of Bronze Age metalworking, but equally he saw metalworking that was potentially associated with the Iron Age. So this feature here is probably absolutely nothing got to do with Downpatrick and Downpatrick Hill and the creation of the monastic site and the cathedral and everything else. It may have been a site that physically sat at the base of this hill quite independently of any other archaeology. And similarly, the hut site that appeared over on the west, on the east side of the excavations, equally that has probably nothing to do with the fact that, or with the later addition in the 11th and 12th centuries of Downpatrick, the hill, the cathedral, the monastic site. And these 2 sites are probably indicative of the wealth of the archaeology in the Downpatrick in general, rather than or not specifically associated with the monastic site itself. So other excavations in the area were took place when a series of large pits were excavated in order to take a series of manhole covers for new water mains that were excavated, and this was undertaken in 2010. Archaeological Development Services, who undertook the excavations on the visitor centre, also undertook these excavations. And in manhole number 4, this manhole here, the excavations down the circular pit, you can see a 2.5, maybe 3 metre wide pit, excavated to take a large precast concrete pipe, uncovered a series of timbers. This is the timber. So this is the base of the pit. That's a plan, if you like. That's a plan of the features, and all of those lines that you can see at the base are all timbers, many of which were worked, and this is what they look like in plan photograph. Potentially, you can see there each of the ends of the timbers, and many of the ends of the timbers, should I say, had evidence for metalworking or being worked, and it's possible that this is some sort of a platform or some sort of a harbour feature or some sort of a path feature running along the base of Downpatrick Hill. So the other two series of excavations that took place, or two series of investigations, one was the Time Team in 1997, and their work adds quite considerably to our understanding of Downpatrick and Downpatrick Hill, and the other is Cathedral Hill itself, excavations which took place in 2018 and 19 for the Centre of Field Archaeology. I really like this image from 1997 because it shows just how low tech we were back in the day. So now it's all hyper graphics, and we all slot stuff in with our super duper computer programs. But back then, when Time Team did this excavation, they went and they cut out the geophysical information and they sellotaped it down to the top of a map. But that was high tech at the time, because the geophysics that they did was actually fantastic. And you can see in the top right hand corner the dark bands, the linear feature running around here, lovely geophysical anomaly running around, and you can see it continuing right around the bottom. And then outside that main feature is a secondary feature running around the outside, which is again picked up running around down here. And when we turn that into a more cool, sexy graphic, this is what we get. So this is the Time Team's geophysics up here and down here. And indeed, I think they did, they're also responsible for the lighter blues, if I'm not mistaken. But certainly, they uncovered a really nice line of geophysical anomalies running all the way around the west of the cathedral itself, and in fact they've also found they got a double layer running around some other anomalies as well within the enclosure. But but interesting enough, Proudfoot back in the 1950s, they undertook an excavation down in this area, if my memory serves me right, and they also came across double ditch feature down to the south of Cathedral Hill. So moving on to the other series of information, and again this is all thanks to Brian Sloan, who works for the Centre of Archaeological Fieldwork in Queens. He originally undertook an excavation in advance of the erection of the new High Cross to the west of the cathedral in 2018. And on the right there, you can see the plan of the area that he required to excavate, which took the physical foundation of the cross itself. And he also undertook small excavations in advance of the erection of some interpretive boards. But it is this area here, the area underneath the cross itself, which proved the most interesting. And in that area, Brian came across this is the excavation of the pit itself for the cross slab, and in that excavation, Brian came across evidence for 14 individuals, all of which had an east-west orientation, suggesting that all of them were Christian. They were extended, they were lying on their backs with the head facing west, so they could rise to meet the rising sun on the day of judgment. It's interesting, and I might just spend a bit of time talking about this. Although he uncovered 14 individuals, he only excavated 9. And that's an interesting point with archaeological excavation, that just because you uncover something doesn't mean you necessarily have to investigate it. And it's a truism to say that if something is not going to be disturbed, it's better left in the ground than it is to be excavated. A lot of people say to me, why don't you excavate that site or this site or the next site? It's important to remember that archaeology, whether we like it or not, is another form of destruction. Although we like to preserve, or we preserve as much as we can by record, nonetheless, it is always better to leave archaeology in situ in the ground. And so consequently, Brian, when he excavated, or when he uncovered 14 individuals, only 9 of those required to be excavated, because only 9 were under threat from the development. And so there are still, well, in that pit, there would still be evidence for another 5 bodies, but they have been preserved in situ for future generations, if ever is required to excavate them. So of those 9 3 were adults, and interestingly, 6 were neonatal. So 6 were young, either young children or newborns. And it's well, not newborns, just young children. But that's interesting in itself. That if they had adults and children, then we're not dealing with sort of necessarily a monastic abbey type situation. We're dealing with presumably a community who were using that area for interment. But the dates that Brian got from the excavation suggest a date range of between the 11th and the 15th century. So that's 1200 to 1600 in date, which is maybe the lower bodies might have been associated with the monastic, but certainly the later ones were buried in holy ground. And that's just a picture there of the really nice cross in the course of its erection. So the other site that Brian excavated was as part of a community archaeology, and some people may have heard him talk about this before, but fascinating bit of archaeology, and indeed a great way of spreading the word about archaeology among as wide a range as possible. This idea of community archaeology, it's becoming quite popular, and I would be, for one, hugely supportive of it as a way of both letting people know about archaeology, but also introducing people to the archaeological process and the stories it can tell. So this is, again, this is the area that Brian chose to excavate. It was an extension of an area that the Time team had excavated in 97. And they had uncovered a section of walling, and Brian went back to open this area up over 2 seasons. So top left-hand corner shows where the general area of as is known as the tennis courts, and then top right are the 2 trenches. This trench 1 is the one that's in the photograph, and then Brian opened a small additional cutting to the north of that in 2019. he got a series of features as he excavated down through the archaeology. He got prehistoric material in the form of lithics. He got early medieval form archaeology in the form of souterrain ware. But by far the bulk of the material he got came from a refuse pit associated with this wall, and the bulk of that material was between the 11th and the 14th centuries. Interestingly enough, just recently, Brian has come back with some interesting results from his other trench, where a recut ditch, or I should say the original form of the ditch, which had been recut in the medieval period, he got a bit of pottery from that, which has been dated to the Bronze Age. So he's getting Bronze Age activity on top of the site, which again suggests that this area was, they would have had a range of buildings, and the range of buildings would have consisted of a cloister and a series of buildings around that cloister. And it is possible that what Brian and the time team have found is a segment of wall associated with some of this range of buildings, not necessarily as depicted in that drawing, which is a conjectural reconstruction from the early 1900s. But nonetheless, we have a suggestion that we've got evidence of buildings on the north side of the early the monastery, and the date of the 11th century, 12th century, 13th century that Brian got would reflect this the Benedictine range. So looking at these are a couple of wonderful sort of conjectural reconstructions of Cathedral Hill over the generations, starting in the 11th century with the foundation of the site itself, and we have a circular enclosing ditch running all the way around the outside, with the high cross and some early churches, presumably stone replacing wood, as we found in previous talks, in this series of talks, with the monks' buildings and then domestic occupation around the outside. Then in the 12th century, when we get the monastic site itself, founded by John de Courcy in 1183, the Benedictines came in, and here we have the monastery itself with this range of buildings. Again, you'll note conjecturally reconstructed there, but you can see that the round tower is there. We still have our large enclosing ditch running around the outside. We have our round tower, our church with a range of buildings, and it's in this area here that Brian would have carried out his excavations, suggesting that maybe it's one of these buildings that Brian uncovered evidence for. So just a list there, you can read them yourselves, a potted history of the site down through the ages. We have obviously the arrival of St. Patrick and the death of Patrick in 461, and then we have the first recorded abbey associated with Downpatrick was in 753, and then we have references in the 9th century there, 824, for the monasteries of Down being raided by the Vikings. And then you can run your list down there, but the other one there is the founding of the Benedictine monastery there in 1183, an important date in the development of the high monastic site in the 13th century. So in summary, really, or not necessarily in summary, but just to sort of maybe get together a few thoughts. This is an image of Downpatrick around the time of the early foundation, so around 1100, 1200, and you can immediately see the amount of blue. This would have been the extent of the Coil marshes running all the way around before it was drained. You have the mound of Down up here being quite a prominent peninsula running out into the marshes, and also you've got what was to become Cathedral Hill, or what became Cathedral Hill, another quite prominent peninsula jutting out into the marshy Coil flooded ground to the north, to the west, and to the south. This is the area down here at the foot of the hill where we found the evidence for the possible harbour or wooden feature in that we came up in that water, the waterworks that were undertaken in 2010. And it's also the area immediately to the north of that where we found the evidence in the archaeological excavations that I undertook in advance of the Downpatrick Visitor Centre, where we found evidence for our ironworking and our early medieval hut sites. And so so the metalworking and the hut sites and the possible harbour area were potentially there prior to the development of the Cathedral Hill. And it makes sense to have the ironworkings down by the shoreline where water was easily accessible. It's also a good place to live because you're close to the water, and obviously they have the harbour area down there. And then the development of the monastic site on top of the hill with the Benedictine priory and the various bits and pieces. And so this is the summary, if you like, of the various archaeological features. So we have the blue line, which is the internal line, if you remember, that the time team found. So time team found evidence for a large internal ditch running around the entire west side of the hill, and you can conjecturally continue that. Sorry, you can so they found it all the way around here, and the dotted line would suggest that it continued in a complete circle. Then in the 12th century, when the abbey itself had been founded and had been established, it's possible the outer ditch is the one that we found down here in the area. So we found the evidence for a 12th, 13th century ditch down here in the lower slopes of the hill. And then we have the cross boundary, which we found the later boundary, the post-medieval field boundary running across the top of the hill here, with the harbour potentially, evidence for the harbour found in the excavations of the waterworks pits running along the foot of the hill. And that's it, Aidan, I think. This is just a really nice image from Wesley, his image of the Cathedral Hill in 1778, with the round tower still extant at that stage, and it's something that the time team, although they looked for it, they never actually found evidence for that. So that's interesting. There's still a bit of work to be done to try and find the foundations for that monastic, or the round tower, which is clearly there someplace and there to be found. All right, so thanks very much, everybody, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thanks very much, Eoin. So anybody wants to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it yourself, or put it on the chat and we can pass it over to Eoin to answer.